Hello, in this video, we are going to talk about genes and alleles. So this is kind of the first video talking about genetics, and we are going to be talking about essentially how certain traits get inherited from parent to offspring. So for example, in this picture, we see this plant and it has characteristics such as purple flowers. And so what are the genes and alleles that are involved in that? And so that is what we're going to cover. So the person who kind of started all of this concept of inheritance was Mendel, and he did a lot of experiments with plants, specifically pea plants. And what he was looking at were traits. So he looked at these pea plants and he saw, some had purple flowers, some had white flowers, some had, peas that were wrinkly, some peas were smooth. And he was just looking at all of these traits. So a trait is some kind of variation in physical appearance. So a trait could be purple flowers versus white flowers, for example. And what he did was, again, this was before the discovery of genes or alleles or anything. So he didn't really know what was happening. But what he would do was get two parent flowers. So we call them the pea generation. And he would breed them together by cross-pollinating them. And he would then look at the characteristics or the traits of the F1 generation. F1 is your offspring, the first generation of offspring. And he would sometimes, after getting that result, self-pollinate. So you can self-pollinate flowers, meaning you can breed it with itself. And then you would get a second generation, which we call the F2 generation. So, and of course, you could keep doing this F3, F4. But for the purpose of this video, let's just go through these first three generations. So you've got your parents, your first generation, and your second generation. And again, Mendel, his whole thing was looking at the different characteristics, seeing how some traits were inherited. So for example, he would see that when you crossed a violet or purple flower with a white flower, you would get all purple flowers for your F1 generation, but then in the F2, you would see the white flowers come back. And so he was just trying to figure out what was going on here. And he kind of, decided to name some of the traits based on whether you see them more often or not. And we call those the dominant versus the recessive traits. And again, he's looking at all of these traits in pea plants. So this is just, a diagram of some of the different traits that he looked at. So for example, the shape of the seeds, again, the color of the flowers, the height of the plant. And what he found was that there were traits that he considered dominant, meaning that they always showed up in a hybrid. Now, what is a hybrid? It is when you get a parent that has the two different traits. So you have a purple flower and a white flower. And when you breed those two together, he often saw that you would only get one of the traits for all of the offspring. So in the previous diagram, we saw that purple mixed with white would give us all purple. And so he designated purple as the dominant trait because it showed up in the hybrid, the offspring of the two. And then the other trait would be designated as the recessive because it would disappear. But then he often saw that that trait would reappear in the following generation. So these recessive traits kind of disappear and then reappear in different generations, whereas a dominant trait typically is found in all generations. And so again, that was his whole thing, was looking at different traits, trying to figure out what was dominant and recessive. Again, this was prior to knowing anything about genetics or alleles. He was just making observations. Now, another kind of vocab word that I want to cover in this video is the concept of the phenotype versus genotype. So phenotype is the physical characteristics of an organism. So the way I remember it is pH, physical, they both start with pH, phenotype, physical. And so these are the things that you can see. So what Mendel was studying were the phenotypes. He was looking at purple flowers versus white flowers, mixing them together and seeing that all the babies were also going to be purple. And so all he was looking at were the phenotypes, whereas the genotypes are the actual genes. And again, Mendel was not able to look at the genotype because at the time, this was a while ago, he was not able to, do any DNA sequencing. There was none of that technology. So he was strictly looking at the phenotype. And what he was really looking at, or kind of trying to understand, is this concept of an allele. So an allele is a variation of a gene. So we know that genes are segments of DNA that code for something. and an allele is a variation of that gene. So for example, there are alleles that code for yellow pea plants versus green, or for example, with the flowers, purple flowers versus white flowers. And so they both govern the color of the flower. So the allele is, determining the color of the flower, but then there's different versions of it. So a purple version and a white version. And so that is part of the genotype. And again, Mendel wasn't able to actually see this, but he was just trying to understand how phenotypes were inherited. And so here's a diagram if we were to just look strictly at phenotype. Oh, okay, I have a yellow pea and a green pea. I cross them together and all of my offspring in the F1 generation are yellow. But then in the F2 generation, now I have 3 yellow, 2, 1 green. And by the way, these are percentages, so a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, if we were to do it under genotype, it would look something like this. And so in the next slide, I'm going to explain what these letters mean and how we kind of designate dominant versus recessive. But an allele is just a variation of a gene. So the yellow allele versus the green allele for the pea color, or purple versus white for the flower color. And so how we describe genotypes is using letters. And so we designate the dominant allele. So whatever allele we know is the dominant one, we will designate it as the capital letter. And the letter doesn't really matter. We just use an arbitrary letter. I typically like to use the letters A or B because the capital letters are different from the lowercase. If you use the letter C or O, for example, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between a capital O and a lowercase o. Anyway, so dominant alleles are always written with a capital letter and recessive alleles are always written with a lowercase letter. Now, remember, all organisms, most eukaryotic organisms, are going to have 2 copies of each gene. So, for example, us humans, we have 2 copies of each chromosome, right? 23 pairs. And so on each chromosome, you're going to have 2 genes. And so you're going to have 2 copies. And each person is either going to be capital B, that's going to be designated as homozygous dominant, or lowercase b, that's homozygous recessive. And so the folks who have 2 copies of the same version are going to be considered homozygous, whereas the individuals who are heterozygous are going to have 1 copy of the dominant and 1 copy of the recessive allele. And so typically you're going to be written as capital B, lowercase b, or vice versa. Again, remember, you inherit 1 from your mom and 1 from your dad. So I just like to think about it as, your DNA is a cookbook. I inherited a cake recipe from mom and I inherited a cake recipe from dad. Let's say that mom's cake recipe was for chocolate cake and dad's recipe was for vanilla. And one of them, let's say chocolate, is the dominant. And so that's, if I was heterozygous, that means I have 1 of each copy. Now, let's say I inherited both chocolate cake from mom and also chocolate cake from dad, then I would be homozygous because I have the same recipe. And so that's essentially what these homozygous and heterozygous mean. And again, with the homozygous, you can go further and say homozygous dominant, meaning that this individual has both copies of the dominant allele, or homozygous recessive, they have both copies. They have 2 copies of the recessive allele. And then with heterozygous, you just have to say heterozygous and that's enough. All right, so this was all for this video. Again, this is just an introduction to alleles and the concept of genotype. In the next video, we're actually going to go over how we can use these letters to figure out how different traits can be inherited from parent to offspring and kind of explain what Mendel saw with his pea plants. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.